Okay, so for the next campaign, I'm going to need you all to roll up the characters that are being paid to track down your old characters and bring them to justice for all of the murder hobo crazy stuff that you just did. I'm not actually joking, that's seriously a campaign I've run before. Today, let's talk about some narrative tricks you can use to tie your campaign together on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello, travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is about to run a game on the theme of taking responsibility for your actions. You know what you did. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome back to Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e, a series that discusses the tips, tricks, and advice that Paizo offers storytellers for use at our gaming tables. Today, we're going to take a look at some narrative tricks that a game master can use to tie their campaigns together to help lead to a more coherent story. Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e is a series that is intended for storytellers of all skill levels, from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e is not your preferred game, I still invite you to be a part of the conversation. Maybe you'll learn something interesting you can bring back to your preferred game. So, regardless of what you play or how long you've been playing it, I invite you to join in the conversation. Recently in this series, we've started discussing a model of campaign structure that Paizo offers storytellers to help us think through and piece together the stories we want to create for our players. Now, Paizo gives us what is essentially a three-tiered structure to help us work through crafting a story. It starts with a big picture campaign structure overview, moves down to a smaller adventure design or story arc level structure, and then finally focuses in on the most detailed portion, which is encounter design. Storytellers work through these three steps, and hopefully at the end of it, come out with a story that will be enjoyable for their players. Now, it is worth noting, this is not the only way you can go about writing a campaign. There are other strategies that other storytellers use, but I think this is a good model, especially for beginner game masters, to help us think through the stories we'd like to write. And right now, we're looking at that top tier, the big picture, the campaign structure itself, and thinking about the broad strokes that go into designing a Pathfinder 2e campaign. Today in specific, as we talk about the big picture of our campaign structure, what we really want to ask is, what can we do as storytellers to tie our campaign together in a way that is engaging and exciting for our players? Campaigns, especially long campaigns, will naturally have a number of different story arcs inside of the game, and as such, you want to find a way to logically connect the various stories together so that your players will remain invested throughout the whole thing. If you're interested in reading up more on this topic, I suggest checking out the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e from pages 36 through 37. And before we dive into the topic itself, really quick, let me do all the YouTube stuff. If you enjoy the video, please give it a like and a share, subscribe to the channel, check out my free Discord and my Patreon, both of those are linked in the video description, and most importantly, jump into the comments section, be a part of the conversation. I love to hear what you all have to say. Alright, let's get started. In the last video, we talked about extended and epic campaigns in specific, which really have a lot of time for your players to, well, get into a lot of trouble. And the variety of events that can happen inside such campaigns is, honestly, it's sometimes almost incomprehensible. Player characters get in and out of so much trouble, it can be hard keeping a story on track. So today, we want to ask, what can a game master do, especially in longer campaigns, to help tie together a story in a way that is narratively satisfying? And in specific today, I want to take a look at 4 different possibilities for how to tie a campaign together that you might use as a storyteller. I want to talk about villains, player goals, changing the world, and campaign theme. These are not necessarily the only thing that might tie a campaign together, but these are some good options to start with, so they're the ones we're going to talk about today. I want to take a look at them each individually, talk about a strength of that particular tactic, a weakness of that particular tactic, and some advice I have if that's the narrative thread that you want to use to tie everything together. However, before we dive into them individually, I do want to say this. As a storyteller, don't feel like you have to be limited to just one of these options or just one of another option you might come up with. It is okay to weave several different narrative threads together to help weave that overall story. And if you use multiple threads, it allows you to emphasize and de-emphasize various threads at different times to help keep the variety of a story going, so don't feel like you have to rely on just one of the tactics we're going to discuss today. Now, the first narrative thread option that we're going to talk about today is, I think, probably the one that game masters will naturally default to, especially early in your storytelling career, and that is the villain. The big bad evil guy, BBEG, we see that terminology thrown all around the gaming community. It's a common trope, it's a fun trope, honestly, and I think it's one that storytellers naturally gravitate towards. It's so easy to use, it's so quickly identifiable. Villain is definitely a thread that can tie a story together very easily. If I'm being honest, my first truly epic D&D campaign that ran from 1 to 20 was tied together primarily through its villain. Years ago, when I was getting started as a D&D storyteller, I ran a campaign where Cthulhu was going to wake up and destroy the world, and the players had to stop it. By the way, does anyone remember when Call of Cthulhu published D&D 3.5 Cthulhu stats? Yeah, I had some fun with that. Villains create such an easy and natural narrative thread that as a storyteller, it's one of the easiest ones you can pull off, and even if you plan on using other narrative threads, oftentimes you're probably going to include a villain with whatever other tactic you might be employing. And there are a couple of strong reasons why you might choose to use the villain as kind of the ultimate narrative tie-in for the story that you're telling, and the first one is clarity. The goal of the campaign is to defeat that particular person. Are they still standing? Guess what? The story's still going. You might have to deal with minions and agents and mini-bosses, but at the end of the day, you have a very clear ultimate goal in terms of the main villain for your story, and the clarity that a good villain provides can be a very easy driving force for a campaign. And on top of that, villains can be a very mobile type of story to tell. As the villain moves from city to city, country to country, and maybe even travels all around the globe, your characters will naturally chase them because that's the story. That's what they are here to do. Another very powerful narrative thread that comes with the villain is often the level of personal antagonism that you find between player characters and their villain. But I guarantee you, your players are motivated to find the person who killed their father, or other significant NPC in their life. Additionally, as the back and forth between players and villains develops, that personal antagonism is naturally going to grow. That time that your players almost caught the villain is going to make them that much more focused on getting them next time. And the time that your players foiled this particular plan is going to cause the villain to take it personally and prepare for your player characters in special ways in future adventures. That personal back and forth is intense, it's engaging, it's exciting, and it's a big reason why villains make such good narrative threads for your story. Now, that's not to say that villains are a perfect narrative thread. They do have some flaws. A villain can get repetitive quick. Oh, it's this guy again. We've seen him before, we've beat him before, why do we care that he's back? If a strong and antagonistic relationship doesn't exist between the PCs and villain, it can kind of come off as cheap, repetitive, and something that your players could get bored of very quickly. On the flip side, another flaw with the villain as a narrative thread is if your players go and do something you weren't prepared for and kill said villain. I think every storyteller has found themselves in this situation at one point or another. I planned for them to fight the villain here, but they stopped him over here, and now I don't know what I'm going to do. Now, there are obviously ways that you can address some of these things, and one of the easiest is, as I mentioned earlier, concepts like minions and agents, people who work for the primary villain so that your players can't get to them directly, at least not at first. There are certainly ways you can guard against these potential downfalls, but do bear in mind that villains as a narrative tool do carry some risks. If you decide you want a villain to be a major narrative thread, though, there is something important as a storyteller you need to think about, and that is good villains change. As the story progresses, your villain should also progress. Something should be different about them. Something should be changing at different points in the narrative. If the villain is the same when your players are level 3 and level 13, that villain is going to lose interest. An easy way to ensure change is for your villains to react to your players, but there are other things you can do narratively inside the world as well. The point is this: don't let your villains become static, or that narrative thread could cause your story to become a little bit stiff. Now, a second option that you might consider as a narrative thread for the story that you're going to tell might be something that you as a storyteller don't actually come up with. You could use player goals as your narrative thread instead. And there is a lot to love about this approach. Spending time talking to your players, asking about their characters, getting an idea of what they want from the story, and getting a good picture of where they want the story to go. All of this taken together can really help push a story in a very clear and exciting direction, and because your players are the ones coming up with the goals, they are naturally very, very invested in the story that you're telling. In fact, that is the primary positive of this particular approach. Using player goals as the narrative thread of your story is the most surefire way to ensure that your players are going to be invested in whatever it is that you're doing. And as a side benefit, this is, at least up front, one of the easier narrative threads that you can use. Your players are generating the goals, they're generating the main ideas, they're generating the core plot elements that are going to be driving the story, so really you're not generating those concepts so much as putting those concepts into practice. It saves you some work as a storyteller, which is not too bad. But there are some flaws here. And the most obvious is this: clashing narratives. Let's be honest, any storyteller with any experience knows that players have a bad habit of not paying attention to what everyone else at the table is trying to do, and it is really, really easy for different players to drive their characters in wildly different directions that are honestly in contrast with one another. You can have two players come up with two very wonderful story concepts, but those stories will naturally push their characters in opposite directions to the point where you as a storyteller are desperately trying to hold the story together, and your players don't have a lot of motivation to help you do it. If you want to use player goals as a major narrative thread for your campaign, I think the most important piece of advice here is you gotta do your homework before the campaign starts. Player goals are a fantastic narrative thread if your group is willing to put in the time with their session 0 or even before the session 0 to really make sure that the group that they are constructing is intended to work well together narratively. Even a single person that is pushing too far off course can potentially wreck a story if you're not careful. So if you want to use this approach it can go beautifully, but as a storyteller, you definitely want to sit down with your group, communicate what you're trying to do very clearly, and make sure your group is communicating very well with one another, meaning that if you're running with a group that doesn't know each other very well, this might not be the best narrative thread to use. Now let's move on to a third option that can be a narrative thread for your story. And this is what I call the change the world option. And especially for long-term campaigns, if you're going to be running a year or more with a particular group, you want what your players do to impact the world that their characters inhabit. You want the world to be a different place because of what your characters did. And that concept that your PCs are going to change the world can be a fantastic narrative thread, not just even inside one campaign, but potentially across multiple campaigns. Years ago in Pathfinder 1st Edition, I took a look at the Starstone Tower that exists in the Golarion setting, and I thought, you know what? If there is a tower that allows people to become deities, why not run a campaign where one of my players gets to become a deity? And so at the very start of the campaign, I told all of my players, at the end of this campaign, one of your characters will become a recognized deity in the Golarion setting at my gaming table, and to this day my players can readily pick to worship Datrin the Realm Splitter, patron of family and fraternity. Datrin might not be a published deity as far as Paizo is concerned, but because of that campaign, my players changed the world, and it impacted not just that story, but many of the other stories that I've told since then. In that particular campaign, every story arc, directly or indirectly, fed into this ultimate goal of eventually my players were going to face the test of the Starstone, and one of them was going to make it. Now, obviously, the phrase change the world doesn't have to be so dramatic at your gaming table, and there have been other change the world stories that I've run that were far less significant in their overall consequence, but you can clearly see how setting the stage of this is how we are going to change the setting, that can very easily be a powerful narrative thread for your campaign. In fact, the number one benefit of the change the world narrative thread is the sense of accomplishment that your players are going to get. I'll be honest, I use change the world a lot, even if it's only a supporting thread to other narrative techniques that I use, because one of the things I like to do is I like to allow my players the chance to change the world that they're going to play in. What happened in my previous Golarion campaign is affecting my current Golarion campaign, and my players can see the actions of their old characters manifesting in various ways in the new campaign. And with that comes an incredible sense of accomplishment. Knowing that your players will change the world, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse, knowing that they are going to leave their mark on their world's history is something that is intrinsically satisfying in the narrative sense. But there are dangers with this approach, and there's an old term that really applies to this approach that you gotta look out for: railroading. If you set up your campaign on the premise that your players are going to change the world, it's really easy to draw a very straight line from where your party begins to where they're going to end, and to lay the tracks and not give your party any opportunity to deviate from the story that you just wrote. Change the world narrative threads can be very engaging, or in the worst case, they can strip your players of almost all agency. Now, I will say I think sometimes the word railroading can get overblown in TTRPG circles, but there is a version of railroading that is very disappointing for a player, and if you're trying to use the Change the World story as your main narrative thread, that version of railroading is a real threat to your story, which is why if you want to use the Change the World narrative thread, I strongly recommend this: write multiple endings. The easiest way to avoid railroading is, as a storyteller, to offer a variety of potential endings that your players can potentially select based on their actions. In another campaign, I remember once writing 11 different possible endings for the story I had constructed. There was one really, really bad ending. There was one they basically walked away from it ending. And then there were 9 various shades of good ending that the players could possibly earn. And I'm sure most experienced storytellers will not be surprised to hear my players chose none of the above. Thanks, guys. But hey, even though my players refused to pick any of the 11 I wrote, I was able to adapt one of the 11 endings and still use a version of it at the end of that campaign. But the simple trick is this: if you want to avoid railroading your players so that the change of the world narrative feels engaging to your players, using multiple endings is a very easy way to do that. There is a final narrative thread that you can use to tie your campaigns together, and this one is a little bit more vague than the other 3 that we've talked about so far, but it's also one of my favorites, and that is with the use of a formally stated campaign theme of some kind. Essentially, you communicate to your players the theme of your campaign, whatever it may be, and then allow that theme to guide the story as it develops for your players. This is a very open-ended approach. You can get a lot of different outcomes from using this, and you can tie a lot of different types of stories together in this fashion, but it's a little bit complicated to use as well. Let me give you a couple of examples that I've done. A few years ago in Pathfinder 1st Edition, I ran a campaign called Before All Is Lost, and I told my players at the start of the campaign that the theme was loss. Everything in that game, from beginning to end, one way or another, was a reflection on the subject of loss. Different types of loss that people experience, different ways that people react to loss, what it means to build back after a loss. Every story arc looked at the subject of loss from a different perspective, and sometimes it was a positive perspective, sometimes it was a negative perspective, but in every instance it all tied back to that single theme. When my current Pathfinder 2e campaign started, I sent all of my players a message, and I told them explicitly what the theme of the campaign was going to be. I took the old phrase, "children bearing the sins of their fathers," and I turned that into a campaign theme. I basically told them, all of your PCs, your parents did something really bad, and your character is living under the weight of your parents' actions, and the theme of the campaign in various different ways has been an exploration of, do children carry the sins of their parents? Should they carry the sins of their parents? And what is the impact of that kind of situation? In my current campaign, my players have responded to this theme in very different ways. I have one PC that has taken the approach, my parent was basically a decent person who made a mistake, and I am trying to redeem their actions. And there is another player who has gone the complete opposite direction, hates their parents, and has utterly rejected them because of what their parent did. And it has led to some very interesting storytelling and decisions, as my players have had these 2 different reactions to the same theme. This highlights the primary benefit of using a theme as the narrative thread for your campaign, which is, you get a lot of variety when you do this. Themed stories can lead to a lot of different possible iterations of the same concept. Different people may react to the same subject different ways, and because of that, you can really get a lot of different stories out of a good narrative theme. So the incredible variety that comes with themed stories is one of the reasons I really love using this as a narrative thread for my games, but I will admit, theme can be a hard narrative thread to pull off. That's one of its big flaws. If your players aren't interested in the theme, your story is going to fall flat. A few years ago, I was running a particular themed campaign, and most of the players at my table bought into the theme. They liked it, they thought it was fun, and they really wanted to see what I could do with that kind of story. but 2 of my players refused to buy in. And no matter how many times I talked to them about it, I never got them there, and ultimately that proved to be detrimental to the overall enjoyment of the group. You want your players to be invested in the story, but sometimes investing in a theme is a lot more nebulous and a lot more vague, and for some players that might be very hard to do. And that's why my main advice for using theme as a narrative thread is, if you want to use theme, tell your players up front. Let them know, this is what I'm doing, these are the types of stories I'm telling, this is the theme of the game. Clear communication is critical because theme can be a vague concept, and if your players don't get what you're going for, they're probably going to get lost along the way. But that is 4 quick examples of different narrative threads that you might use to tie your overall campaign together across a variety of story arcs. Now in this video I've talked about villains, player goals, changing the world, and campaign themes, but there are probably other narrative threads that you can use as well, so let me turn the conversation over to you. What do you think about the narrative threads I've presented in this video, and are there narrative threads that I haven't mentioned that you think could be effective in tying a story together? Leave your thoughts in the comments section down below. Also, don't forget to do all the YouTube stuff. Like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel. Check out my free Discord and my Patreon, linked in the video description. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.